Before we dive into this powerful story about respect, family, and hidden truths, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This journey will show you that we should never judge someone by their circumstances, and that sometimes, the people society overlooks have the most surprising stories to tell. Enjoy. My name is Edward Morrison, but everyone has always called me Eddie. I'm 78 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened just 8 months ago. It's a story that taught me the hardest lesson of my life. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most can be the ones who know you the least. It started on a cold Tuesday morning in March, when my son Richard and daughter Susan showed up at my door with expressions I'd never seen before. There was determination in their faces, mixed with guilt and something that looked disturbingly like relief. I was in my kitchen making my usual morning coffee when they let themselves in with their spare keys. After 78 years on this earth, I still moved around just fine. Thank you very much. Sure, I was a little slower getting up the stairs, and maybe I needed my reading glasses more often, but my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Dad, we need to talk, Richard said, as they positioned themselves in my living room, like they were conducting some kind of intervention. This was the same living room where I'd taught them to play chess, helped them with homework every night, after working 2 jobs, and comforted them through every childhood disappointment. Now they were sitting there, looking at me like I was a problem that needed to be solved. "What's on your minds?" I asked, bringing them coffee the way they'd liked it since they were teenagers. Richard with 2 sugars, Susan with just cream. Susan, now 52, and my little girl who used to cry when she had to kill a spider, couldn't even look me in the eye. "Dad, Richard and I have been talking, and we think it's time." "Time for what, sweetheart?" Richard, 55, and always the one who thought he knew what was best for everyone, cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a business presentation. "Dad, you're 78 years old. You live alone in this big house. What if you fall down the stairs? What if you have a heart attack? What if something happens and nobody finds you for days?" I looked at my son, this man I'd worked 6 days to put through college, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Richard, I'm perfectly fine. I take care of myself, I take care of this house, I drive myself to the grocery store and the doctor. What exactly are you worried about?" "But Dad," Susan said, finally meeting my eyes with tears already forming, "you're not fine. Last week when I called, you couldn't remember what you'd had for lunch." I stared at her in disbelief. "Susan, I couldn't remember what I had for lunch because it was a Tuesday, and I eat the same turkey sandwich every Tuesday that I've eaten for the past 10 years. It's called routine, not memory loss. And 2 weeks ago, you forgot Cousin Mary's birthday," she continued, like she was reading from a list of my supposed failures. "I didn't forget Mary's birthday. I chose not to call her because, in the 15 years since your mother died, Mary has called me exactly 0 times. Why should I be the one always reaching out?" Richard leaned forward with that patronizing expression he'd perfected in his corporate job. "Dad, you're being defensive. We're not attacking you here. We're trying to help you." "Help me do what?" That's when Susan pulled out a glossy brochure from her purse, and my heart sank. The cover showed smiling elderly people in a manicured garden, with the words "Sunset Gardens Senior Living Community" in elegant script. "We found a wonderful place for you, Dad. It has everything: medical staff on site, activities, meals provided, housekeeping services. You won't have to worry about anything." I looked at that brochure and felt something die inside my chest. "You want to put me in a nursing home?" "It's not a nursing home," Richard said quickly, like the terminology made any difference. "It's assisted living. Very upscale, very professional. We've already toured the facility. You've already toured it without me. We wanted to make sure it met our standards before we brought you to see it. Our standards, not my standards, our standards. And what if I don't want to go? The look that passed between my children told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a discussion. This was an announcement. Dad, Susan said, trying to sound gentle but failing miserably. We've already paid the first month's rent. Your room is ready. We think it's best if we help you pack today. Today. I stood up so fast that coffee slopped out of my cup onto the table my wife had picked out 30 years ago. You're taking me today. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be for everyone. Richard said in that same tone he probably used to fire people at his company. Dad, we love you, but we can't take care of you anymore. We have our own families, our own responsibilities, our own lives to live. I never asked you to take care of me. But you will, Dad. Eventually you will. And when that day comes, we won't be able to handle it. This way, you'll be somewhere safe with trained professionals. I looked at these two people I'd raised from babies. These children I'd worked myself to the bone to provide for. These adults I'd helped through divorces and job losses and financial troubles. And I realized they weren't here because they loved me. They were here because I had become inconvenient. What if I refused to go? Richard's mask slipped completely. Dad, we've already consulted with attorneys. Given your age and some of the concerning behaviors we've documented, we can pursue legal guardianship if necessary. The threat hit me like a physical blow. My own son was threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't voluntarily surrender my independence. What concerning behaviors? Susan started listing them off like she was reading charges at a trial. Forgetting conversations, becoming socially isolated, not maintaining the house properly, difficulty managing finances. I looked around my house, the house I'd kept immaculate for 40 years. Where every bill was paid automatically, where I'd just had the gutters cleaned and the furnace serviced. Not maintaining the house. Dad, there are dishes in your sink. I had breakfast an hour ago, and you haven't had anyone over for dinner in months, because the only people who ever came for dinner were you two, and you've been too busy to visit. Richard stood up like the meeting was over. Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We're doing what's best for you. Are you? Or are you doing what's most convenient for you? That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time either of you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited without needing something, or wanting to check up on me like I'm a child? They couldn't answer because we all knew the truth. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the back seat of Richard's BMW, the car I'd helped him buy with a loan he'd never fully repaid. Watching my house disappear in the rearview mirror. Most of my belongings were being put into storage. I was allowed 1 suitcase of clothes and a few photographs, as we pulled into the circular drive of Sunset Gardens. With its perfectly manicured lawn and its cheerful sign promising comfort, care, and community. I made a decision that would change everything. My children thought they were dumping their inconvenient, old father into an institution where he'd be out of their way. They had no idea that their forgetful, declining father was actually worth more money than both of their houses combined. They had no idea that I'd been testing them for months, pretending to be more helpless than I was, waiting to see if they'd step up with love or step back with excuses. And they had no idea that this moment, this betrayal, was about to reveal not just who they really were, but who I really was. Because what I hadn't told Richard and Susan, what I'd never told anyone, was that their simple old dad had been living a double life for the past 20 years. The first thing that hit me when we walked through the doors of Sunset Gardens was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was institutional, a mixture of industrial strength, disinfectant, cafeteria food, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Later, I realized it was the smell of resignation. The lobby was designed to look cheerful and welcoming, with floral furniture and landscape paintings that probably came from a hotel liquidation sale. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and there were fresh flowers on the reception desk that looked like they were replaced weekly whether they needed it or not. Mr. Morrison, a woman in her 40s with an aggressively cheerful demeanor, approached us. "I'm Janet Patterson, the admissions coordinator. We're so excited to welcome you to our community." Community. That's what they called it. Like being forced into an institution against your will was the same as choosing to live in a neighborhood. Richard stepped forward, like he was handling a business transaction. "We appreciate everything you've done to expedite the process, Janet. Dad's room is ready." "Absolutely. Room 237, just like we discussed. It has a lovely view of the garden, and it's close to the nurse's station in case Mr. Morrison needs anything." I wanted to tell them that what I needed was to go home, but I'd already learned that my wants didn't matter anymore. According to my children, I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. "Dad, why don't you sit here while we handle the paperwork?" Susan suggested, guiding me toward a chair like I was a piece of furniture that needed to be positioned properly. I sat down and watched my son and daughter sign documents that officially made me a resident of Sunset Gardens. Documents that I wasn't allowed to read, wasn't asked to approve, wasn't even consulted about. At 78 years old, I had become a package to be delivered. While they handled the business, I observed the other residents in the lobby. There was an elderly woman in a wheelchair staring out the window with vacant eyes. A man about my age was shuffling around in his bathrobe and slippers at 2 in the afternoon, looking lost. 3 women were playing cards at a table, but their conversation was so quiet I couldn't hear it from 10 feet away. These were people who had lived full lives, who had careers and families and accomplishments, and now they were warehoused in a place that treated them like children who needed constant supervision. "All right, Dad," Richard said, returning with a clipboard full of forms. "Everything's taken care of. Janet's going to show you to your room and help you get settled." "When will I see you again?" I asked, though I was already afraid of the answer. Susan kissed my forehead like I was 5 years old. "We'll visit soon, Dad. We promise." "How soon?" "Well, the staff recommends giving new residents time to adjust before having visitors. Maybe in a week or two. A week or two. They were abandoning me for at least 2 weeks so I could adjust to being institutionalized." "But you could call," I said. "Of course, Dad. We'll call to check on you." Check on me, like I was a package they'd shipped and wanted to make sure it had arrived safely. After they left, Janet led me down a hallway lined with generic artwork toward what would be my new home. The carpet was that industrial kind designed to hide stains, and the walls were painted in what I'm sure some decorator called soothing beige. "You're going to love it here, Mr. Morrison," Janet chatted as we walked. "We have bingo on Mondays, movie night on Wednesdays, and craft time on Fridays. There's a library, a small chapel for services, and the dining room serves 3 meals a day." She was describing my life like it was a cruise ship itinerary, except I couldn't get off at the next port. Room 237 was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a small desk, and 1 chair. There was a window that looked out over the garden, a patch of grass with some shrubs that had probably been planted by the lowest bidder. "The bathroom is through that door," Janet said, "and if you need anything, just press this call button." Someone will be here right away. She left me alone with my single suitcase and a feeling of profound displacement. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at what my children had decided would be my world for however many years I had left. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't temporary. Richard and Susan hadn't brought me here to recover from an illness or to get help with something specific. They'd brought me here to stay, to live out whatever time I had left, surrounded by strangers who were paid to take care of me. I thought about my house, my real home, where I'd lived for 40 years, where every room held memories of my late wife Margaret, where I knew every creaky floorboard and every way the light fell through the windows at different times of day. Someone else would probably be living there soon. Sleeping in the bedroom where Margaret and I had shared 43 years of marriage. I thought about my workshop in the basement, where I'd spent countless hours tinkering with inventions and modifications, where I'd developed the ideas that had made me wealthy beyond my children's imagination. They probably thought it was just an old man's hobby room filled with junk. I thought about my investment accounts, my patent royalties, my carefully managed portfolio that generated more money each month than most people made in a year. Richard and Susan had no idea that their financially struggling father was actually worth over $8 million for 20 years. Ever since Margaret died, I'd been living modestly, while secretly building wealth through my inventions and investments. I'd let my children believe I was just getting by on Social Security and a small pension, because I wanted to see who they really were when they thought there was nothing to gain from being good to me. Now, I knew when they thought I had nothing to offer them, when they believed I was becoming a burden instead of a benefit. They'd shipped me off to an institution rather than deal with the inconvenience of an aging parent. That first night in Sunset Gardens, lying in a narrow bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what kind of place this was, exactly how the staff treated the residents, and exactly what my options were. Because if Richard and Susan thought they'd gotten rid of their inconvenient father, they were about to learn that they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. I might be 78 years old, and I might be stuck in this place for now, but I was far from helpless. And I had resources my children couldn't even imagine. The real question was, what I was going to do with those resources, and who I was going to trust with the truth about who I really was. My first week at Sunset Gardens was like living in someone else's nightmare. Every morning at 6 a.m., a cheerful aide would knock on my door to make sure I was up and getting ready for breakfast. As if I hadn't been waking up at dawn for 70 years without supervision, breakfast was served in the main dining room from 7 to 9. And God help you if you showed up at 9:15, because the kitchen was closed and you'd have to wait until lunch. The food wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. The kind of institutional cooking designed to offend no one and please no one. What bothered me most wasn't the loss of freedom, though that was bad enough. It was the way the staff talked to us. Not all of them, but enough of them to make it clear that they saw us as children rather than adults who'd lived full lives. "Good morning, Eddie," they'd say in those sing-song voices people use with kindergartners. "Did we sleep well? Are we ready for our breakfast?" Like I was somehow sharing my sleeping and eating experiences with the aide. "How are we feeling today, Eddie?" when they checked my blood pressure. "Are we taking our medications like a good boy?" When they handed me the vitamins my children had arranged for me to take, I wasn't Eddie to them. I was a collection of tasks to be managed, boxes to be checked, problems to be prevented. The other residents seemed to have accepted this treatment as normal. Mrs. Patterson, from down the hall, actually smiled when the aides talked to her like she was 5 years old. Mr. Henderson always said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, to women young enough to be his granddaughters. But there was one staff member who was different. His name was Michael Rodriguez, and he was one of the evening shift nurses. The first time I met him, he knocked on my doorframe and waited for me to invite him in, rather than just barging into my room like the others did. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Michael Rodriguez, one of the nurses here. I wanted to introduce myself, since I'll be checking on you during the evening shift. Please, call me Eddie," I said, surprised by his respectful tone. "I'd prefer to call you Mr. Morrison, if that's all right with you. I know some of the staff here are more casual, but I believe in showing proper respect to my elders." I studied his face. Michael looked to be in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that immediately put you at ease. He wasn't handsome in a Hollywood way, but he had something better, genuine warmth. "That would be fine, Michael. I appreciate that. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to ask how you're adjusting to life here. I know the transition can be difficult." "An adjustment," I said carefully. I'd learned quickly that complaining about anything at Sunset Gardens was seen as evidence of adjustment difficulties that needed to be addressed with medication or restrictions. "I'm sure it is. Can I ask, was this your choice, or did your family make this decision for you?" The question caught me off guard. None of the other staff had asked about the circumstances that brought me here. They all seemed to assume that everyone was grateful to be at Sunset Gardens. "My family made the decision," I said honestly. Michael nodded without judgment. "That's hard. Even when families have good intentions, it's difficult to lose control over your living situation. You sound like you understand. My grandmother went through something similar. She was perfectly capable of living independently, but my aunts convinced themselves she wasn't safe alone. They moved her into a place like this, and she was miserable for the last 3 years of her life. What happened? She gave up. She stopped fighting, stopped arguing, stopped being herself. She just faded away." I looked at this young man who seemed to understand something that my own children didn't. "Michael, can I ask you something? Of course, do you think the people here are treated with appropriate respect?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Some of the staff are wonderful. They genuinely care about the residents and treat them with dignity. Others see this as just a job, and they forget that everyone here was once young, once independent, once the boss of their own lives. Which kind are you?" "I'm the kind who believes that age doesn't make you less of a person. My grandmother taught me that wisdom comes with experience, and that someone who's lived 70 or 80 years has probably forgotten more than I'll ever know." That conversation was the first real human interaction I'd had since arriving at Sunset Gardens. For the first time in a week, someone had talked to me like I was a whole person rather than a collection of medical needs and potential problems. Over the following days, I started paying attention to how Michael interacted with the other residents. He called everyone by their proper names unless they specifically asked him to use their first names. He listened when they talked, instead of just waiting for them to finish so he could move on to the next task. He remembered details about their lives and asked follow-up questions about things they'd mentioned in previous conversations. Mrs. Chen, who'd been a chemistry professor before retiring, lit up whenever Michael asked her about her research. Mr. Williams, who'd been a jazz musician, would spend 20 minutes telling Michael stories about playing in clubs in the 1960s. And Michael would listen like he was hearing the most fascinating stories in the world. The contrast with the other staff was stark. Most of them were efficient and professional, but they treated us like we were all the same, a collection of elderly people who needed to be kept safe, fed, medicated, and entertained until we died. By the end of my second week, I'd made a decision. If I was going to be stuck in this place, I was going to find out who could be trusted with the truth about who I really was. And Michael Rodriguez was going to be my first test. Because what my children didn't know, what the staff at Sunset Gardens didn't know, was that the simple old man in room 237 had been quietly accumulating wealth and influence for the past 20 years. And if I was going to use those resources to change my situation, I needed to know who my allies were. The question was whether Michael's respect and kindness were genuine, or whether they were just part of a professional facade that would disappear. The moment he learned that I had money, I was about to find out. By my third week at Sunset Gardens, I'd established a routine that probably looked perfectly normal to anyone watching. I ate breakfast at 7:30, spent the morning reading in the library, participated in the afternoon activities to avoid being labeled antisocial, and had dinner at 5:30 with whoever happened to sit at my assigned table. But what the staff didn't know was that I was conducting a careful study of the place and everyone in it. I'd identified which aides genuinely cared about the residents and which ones were just going through the motions. I'd figured out which administrators actually listened to concerns and which ones just smiled and promised to look into it before forgetting completely. I'd learned which residents had families that visited regularly and which ones, like me, had been essentially abandoned. Most importantly, I'd been watching Michael Rodriguez. Every evening when he came on shift, Michael made rounds to check on all the residents in his section. But unlike the other nurses who rushed through their tasks, Michael took time to actually talk to people. I'd seen him spend 15 minutes listening to Mrs. Patterson tell the same story about her late husband for the fourth time that week, responding with the same patience and interest he'd shown the first time. I'd watched him help Mr. Anderson, who had Parkinson's, cut his food without making him feel embarrassed about needing assistance. I'd seen him remember that Mrs. Foster liked her pillows arranged a specific way, and that Mr. Wright preferred his room kept cooler than the standard temperature. These weren't big gestures, but they were the kind of small kindnesses that made the difference between treating someone like a person and treating them like a problem to be managed. On a Thursday evening in my fourth week, Michael knocked on my doorframe as usual. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison. How was your day?" "It was fine, Michael. Same as always." He stepped into my room and closed the door behind him, which was unusual. Normally, he left it open while we chatted. Double quotes, "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" Of course, I've been working here for 3 years, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. Most of the residents here fall into predictable categories. Some are here because they genuinely need care. Some are here because their families panicked about them living alone. And some are here because their families just didn't want to deal with them anymore. I waited for him to continue. "But you're different. You're obviously intelligent, you're in good physical health, and you seem perfectly capable of taking care of yourself. So I'm curious, what's your real story?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, but I wasn't ready to reveal everything. "Yet, what makes you think there's more to my story?" "Several things. You read books that most people here wouldn't understand. I saw you with a biography of Einstein last week. You ask thoughtful questions about how this place operates, like you're analyzing it rather than just experiencing it. And yesterday I overheard you correcting one of the aides when she made an error calculating medication dosages. I'd been caught." Michael was more observant than I'd realized. "You think I don't belong here?" I think you're here for reasons that don't match what I see when I talk to you. I made a decision to test the waters with a small revelation. Michael, what would you say if I told you that my children didn't place me here because I need care, but because they wanted me out of the way? I'd say that happens more often than people want to admit. Adult children get busy with their own lives, and elderly parents become inconvenient. It's sad, but it's not uncommon. And what would you say if I told you that my children might have had financial motivations for putting me here? Michael's expression grew more serious. What kind of financial motivations? The kind where they think they know everything about my assets and capabilities, but they actually know very little. Mr. Morrison, are you saying your children placed you here under false pretenses? I'm saying my children made assumptions about their father's mental capacity and financial situation, and they acted on those assumptions without bothering to verify whether they were correct. Michael sat down in the single chair in my room, clearly intrigued. Can you be more specific? I looked at this young man who'd shown me more respect in 3 weeks than my own children had shown me in 3 years. It was time to start revealing the truth. Michael, what do you know about patents and intellectual property? Not much. Why? Because for the past 20 years, I've been living off the income from 17 different patents I hold on various mechanical and electronic innovations. Last year alone, those patents generated over $400,000 in royalty payments. Michael's eyes widened. $400,000. That's just the patent income. I also have investments, savings, and other assets that my children know nothing about. Mr. Morrison, are you telling me you're wealthy? I'm telling you that when my children decided I was too old and feeble to manage my own life, they never bothered to investigate what exactly they thought they were managing. Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. If that's true, then why are you here? Why don't you just leave? Because, Michael, I want to see who my children really are when they think there's nothing in it for them. I want to see who treats me with kindness when they believe I have nothing to offer them in return. You're testing them. I'm testing everyone, my children, the staff here, the administrators, even you. Me, you've been kind to me, Michael. You've treated me with respect and dignity. But I need to know, is that because you're genuinely a good person, or because it's part of your job? Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that were probably beautiful to someone who chose to be here. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be honest with you. I treat everyone here with respect because I believe that's how human beings should be treated, regardless of their age or circumstances. I don't know if you have $5 or $5 million. And it doesn't change how I'm going to talk to you or care for you. Even if I told you I could make significant financial contributions to causes you care about. Even then. Even if I told you I could help you advance your career or pay for additional education. Mr. Morrison, are you testing me right now? I'm always testing, Michael. That's how you learn who people really are. He turned back to face me. Then here's your answer. I became a nurse because I want to help people, not because I want to get rich or advance my career. If you have money and you want to use it to help people, that's wonderful. But it doesn't change the fact that you're a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity. And if I told you that I'm planning to do something about my situation here and that I might need help from someone I can trust, I'd say that depends on what you're planning to do. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Michael Rodriguez had just passed the first test. Now it was time to see how he'd handle learning the full truth about who I really was. The next evening, Michael arrived for his shift, carrying something I hadn't seen in the 4 weeks I'd been at Sunset Gardens, A laptop computer, Mr. Morrison, he said, after completing his usual rounds. I did some research last night, and I owe you an apology. What kind of research? I looked up your name in the patent database. Edward Morrison, 17 patents filed between 2003 and 2023, covering everything from improved wheelchair mechanisms to energy-efficient HVAC systems. He opened his laptop and showed me the screen. There was my name, listed as the inventor, on patent after patent, with brief descriptions of innovations that had been quietly generating income for years. This one particularly caught my attention, Michael said, pointing to a 2018 patent. Improved transfer mechanism for patient mobility devices. Mr. Morrison, this is the technology that's used in the mechanical lifts we use here at Sunset Gardens. I nodded. Patent number 10,891,562. I get a small royalty payment every time one of those devices is manufactured. Small? About $12 per unit. They manufacture approximately 2,000 units per month. Michael did the mental math. That's almost $300,000 a year from just one patent. It's a living. Mr. Morrison, why didn't you tell your children about this income? I leaned back in my chair and considered how much of the truth I was ready to share. Michael, when my wife Margaret died 8 years ago, I was devastated. For about a year, I wasn't thinking clearly about finances or planning or anything else. I just focused on getting through each day. That's understandable. During that time, Richard and Susan started helping me with things. They took over paying some of my bills. They started handling my grocery shopping. They began making decisions about home repairs and maintenance. They were trying to be supportive. At first, yes, but then I started noticing that their help came with a lot of questions about my finances. How much was I spending on utilities? Did I really need to keep paying for cable television? Wouldn't it be smarter to get a smaller, cheaper car? Michael was listening intently. So I started paying attention to their motivations. And what I discovered was that Richard and Susan had convinced themselves that I was financially struggling, and they were already making plans for how to help me manage my money more efficiently. But you weren't struggling. I wasn't struggling at all. But I realized that my children saw me as a financial burden waiting to happen, rather than as their father who might have his own resources and capabilities. So you decided to test them. Decided to see what would happen if I appeared to be the financially vulnerable elderly man they seemed to expect me to be. I started living more modestly, spending less visibly, and letting them believe that I was dependent on Social Security and a small pension. For 8 years. And Michael, what I learned during those 8 years was that my children loved me conditionally. When they thought I had resources, they were attentive and helpful. When they thought I was becoming a financial burden, they started looking for ways to manage the problem. Michael closed his laptop and looked at me directly. And the problem was you. The problem was me, an aging father who might need expensive care, who might become a drain on their time and money, who might interfere with their own financial planning. So they decided to place you here. They decided to place me here, against my will, based on their assumption that I couldn't afford better care and that I wasn't capable of making my own decisions. Michael was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what I'd told him. Mr. Morrison, what are you planning to do about this? I'm planning to continue my research. I want to understand exactly how this place operates, how decisions are made about residents, and what my legal options are. Your legal options? Michael, my children placed me here by threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent. signed documents on my behalf, and made financial commitments without my consent. I'm curious to know whether those actions were legal. Are you planning to sue them? I'm planning to understand my situation completely before I make any decisions about how to respond. Michael leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something personal? You can ask, do you love your children, despite what they've done? That question caught me off guard, because it went to the heart of the pain I'd been carrying for 4 weeks. Yes, Michael. I love them very much. That's what makes this so difficult. Then what outcome are you hoping for? I'm hoping to find out whether Richard and Susan are capable of learning from this experience, or whether they're the kind of people who will only do the right thing when it benefits them personally. And if they're the latter, then I'll know that I raised 2 children who measure love by convenience and family by financial benefit, and I'll make decisions about my estate and my legacy based on that knowledge. Mr. Morrison, what can I do to help? I looked at this young man who'd shown me more genuine care in a month than my own children had shown me in years. Right now, Michael, I just need someone I can trust to talk to. Someone who sees me as a whole person, rather than as a collection of problems to be managed. You have that? There might come a time when I need more active help. Legal assistance, advocacy with the administration here, maybe even help communicating with people outside this facility. When that time comes, you can count on me. As Michael prepared to continue his rounds, I realized that I'd found something unexpected at Sunset Gardens. Not the community that the brochures promised, but something more valuable. An ally who understood that age doesn't diminish human dignity. Now, I needed to figure out exactly what I was going to do with that alliance. 3 days after my conversation with Michael about the patents, I received my first phone call from Richard since he'd dropped me off at Sunset Gardens. It had been 5 weeks since I'd heard my son's voice, and when the aide told me I had a call, I felt a mixture of hope and dread. "Hi, Dad. How are you settling in?" The casual tone in his voice, like he was calling to check on a vacation reservation, rather than the father he'd institutionalized against his will, made something cold settle in my stomach. But I kept my voice calm. "I'm adjusting, Richard. It's quite an experience." Good, good. I told Susan you'd probably take to it once you got used to the routine. Are you making friends? Participating in activities? Making friends? Like I was at summer camp, instead of confined in an institution. There are some nice people here, Richard, though I have to say, I miss my house. I miss my workshop, my routines, my independence. Dad, you need to let go of that independence thing. The whole point of Sunset Gardens is that you don't have to worry about all those responsibilities anymore. No more house maintenance, no more cooking, no more managing bills. It's like being on permanent vacation. A permanent vacation that I hadn't chosen and couldn't leave. Richard, can I ask you something? Sure, Dad. When was the last time you visited my house? I mean, really looked around, spent time there? I don't know, Dad. Why? Because I'm curious what you thought was so difficult about my living situation that required this ... intervention. Dad, we've been through this. You were showing signs of confusion, isolation, difficulty managing daily tasks. Can you give me specific examples? There was a pause. Well, you forgot things. You seemed confused. Sometimes, when we called, what things did I forget? I don't remember exactly, but Susan mentioned several incidents. And the confusion. Can you describe what that looked like? Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, why are you asking these questions? Are you having second thoughts about Sunset Gardens? I'm trying to understand the decision-making process that led to my being here. The decision-making process was that Susan and I love you and want you to be safe and properly cared for. Did it occur to either of you to ask me what I wanted? Dad, honestly, we couldn't trust your judgment. You were becoming set in your ways, resistant to help, unwilling to acknowledge that you might need assistance. I listened to my son describe me like I was a difficult child who needed to be managed rather than a grown man who had been living successfully for 78 years. Richard, have you been to my house since you brought me here? No, we've been busy getting everything organized. Why, I'm curious about what you've done with my belongings. My workshop equipment, my files, my personal papers. Everything's in storage, Dad. We hired a company to pack everything up professionally. Everything, well, we kept what you'd need at Sunset Gardens and stored the rest. Did you go through my papers, my desk, my filing cabinets? Dad, Susan handled most of that. She said there wasn't much important stuff, just old bills and random paperwork. Random paperwork. Susan had gone through my files and dismissed patent documents, investment statements, and legal papers as random paperwork. Richard, I need to ask you something important. Okay, did either of you find it strange that I was able to maintain a house for 40 years, manage all my finances, and live independently until the exact moment you decided I couldn't? Dad, that's how these things work. People decline gradually, and then suddenly they reach a point where they need help. And you believe that point was 5 weeks ago. Dad, what's with all these questions? Are you unhappy at Sunset Gardens? Because if you are, we can look into other facilities. Other facilities, not going home, not reconsidering the decision, just different institutions. Richard, what if I told you that you and Susan made this decision based on incomplete information? What kind of incomplete information? Information about my mental capacity, my financial situation, and my actual needs. Dad, we had plenty of information. We'd been watching you for months. Watching me do what? Struggling with daily tasks, becoming forgetful, seeming confused about simple things. Or maybe you were watching me test you. Test us. Dad, what are you talking about? I took a deep breath. It was time to plant the first seed. Richard, what do you know about my financial situation? I know you're on Social Security and you have a small pension. Susan looked through your bank statements when we were organizing your affairs. Susan looked through one bank account. Did it occur to either of you that there might be other accounts? Dad, if you had other accounts, you would have mentioned them, would I? 2 children who were constantly worried about my expenses and suggesting I needed to live more cheaply. What are you saying? I'm saying that you and Susan made assumptions about your father's capabilities and resources, and you acted on those assumptions without bothering to verify whether they were accurate. Dad, you're starting to worry me. Are you feeling confused about your finances? The irony was breathtaking. Richard was so convinced that I was mentally declining that he interpreted my hints about hidden assets as evidence of confusion. Not confused about anything, son, but I think you might be. Dad, maybe I should talk to the staff there about having you evaluated by the facility psychiatrist. And there it was, the threat that had brought me here in the first place. Any behavior that didn't match their expectations was evidence of mental decline that needed professional intervention. Richard, before you have me evaluated by anyone, you might want to have Susan take another look at those random papers she dismissed when she went through my files. What papers? The ones that might change your understanding of who your father really is and what he's actually capable of. Dad, you're talking in riddles. If you have something important to tell me, just say it. I'm saying that you put your father in an institution based on assumptions that might be completely wrong. What assumptions? That I'm mentally declining, that I'm financially vulnerable, and that I'm incapable of making my own decisions. Dad, are you saying those assumptions are wrong? I'm saying you never bothered to test those assumptions before acting on them. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Dad, I think I should drive up there this weekend. You're saying things that don't make sense, and I'm worried about you. Richard, you should definitely drive up here. But not because you're worried about my mental state. You should drive up here because your father has some things to explain to you about the biggest mistake you've ever made. After I hung up, I sat in my small room and felt something I hadn't felt in 5 weeks. Anticipation. Richard was coming to visit, expecting to find his confused, declining father who needed psychiatric evaluation. Instead, he was going to start learning the truth about who he'd actually placed in this institution. I had 3 days to prepare for a conversation that was going to change everything between us. Michael found me in the library on Friday evening, 2 days before Richard's scheduled visit. I was reading a book on elder law that I'd requested from the local library system, and taking notes on legal precedents regarding involuntary commitment and guardianship proceedings. Research for your situation? He asked quietly, settling into the chair across from me. Research for my options, I replied. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, if a family member places an elderly relative in a facility like this against their will, based on false claims about their mental capacity and financial situation, what legal recourse does that person have? Michael considered the question carefully. That depends on several factors. Was the placement done through legal guardianship proceedings? No, my children used emotional manipulation and threats, but they didn't go through the courts. Are you here voluntarily, legally speaking? Technically, yes. They threatened to pursue guardianship if I didn't agree to come here, so I signed the paperwork to avoid a legal battle. But you signed under duress. I signed under the threat that they would have me declared mentally incompetent if I refused. Mr. Morrison, if what you're telling me is true, you have several legal options. You can leave any time you want. Since you're here voluntarily, you can pursue legal action against your children for fraud or elder abuse. You can demand that any financial arrangements they made on your behalf be reversed. And what would happen to my relationship with Richard and Susan? That depends on how they respond when they learn the truth. I closed the law book and looked at Michael directly. My son is coming to visit tomorrow. He thinks he's coming to check on his confused, declining father who might need psychiatric evaluation. But instead, he's going to start learning who his father really is. Are you ready for that conversation? I've been ready for 5 weeks. The question is whether Richard is ready to learn that he's made assumptions about his father that are completely wrong. Michael leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, can I ask what you're hoping will happen? I'm hoping that when Richard learns the truth, he'll be ashamed of how he's treated me and motivated to make amends. And if he's not, then I'll know that my son values convenience over love, and I'll make decisions about my future based on that knowledge. What kind of decisions? I looked around the library at the other residents who were reading or dozing in their chairs. Most of them had families who'd made the same calculations Richard and Susan had made. That elderly parents were problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. Michael, what do you know about my estate planning? Nothing. I'm worth approximately $8 million. My will currently leaves everything to Richard and Susan, divided equally. Michael's eyes widened. $8 million. The question, is whether they've earned that inheritance through their treatment of me, or whether it should go to people and organizations that have demonstrated genuine care for elderly people who need support and advocacy. Are you thinking about changing your will? I'm thinking about a lot of things. But first, I want to see how Richard responds when he learns who his father really is. That evening, I called Janet Patterson, the admissions coordinator, and requested a meeting for Saturday afternoon. Of course, Mr. Morrison. Is there a problem with your care? No problem with my care, Janet. But I need to discuss some issues regarding my placement here. What kind of issues? Issues regarding the circumstances under which I was admitted, and whether those circumstances were accurately represented. I'm not sure I understand. You will tomorrow, Janet. My son will be visiting, and I think we need to have a family meeting to clarify some misunderstandings about my situation. Saturday morning, I dressed carefully in my best clothes and spent extra time making sure I looked sharp and alert. I wanted Richard to see his father as he really was, not as the confused old man he expected to find. At exactly 2 o'clock, Richard arrived at the front desk. I watched from the lobby as he signed in and spoke with the receptionist. He looked tired and worried, like a dutiful son coming to check on his declining father. "Dad," he said when he saw me, "you look good. Better than I expected after a phone conversation. I feel fine." Richard, clear-minded and ready to have an important conversation. About what? About the mistakes you and Susan made when you decided to place me here. "Dad, we've been through this. We made the best decision we could based on the information we had." "That's exactly what I want to discuss. The information you thought you had versus the information you actually had." I led him to a quiet corner of the lobby where we could talk privately. "Richard, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Do you love me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course I love you, Dad. That's why we wanted you somewhere safe." "Do you respect me?" "What do you mean? Do you respect my intelligence, my judgment, my right to make decisions about my own life?" "Dad, where is this going?" "Answer the question, Richard. I respect you, but I also recognize that age affects everyone's capabilities. Do you believe I'm mentally competent? I believe you were having difficulties that made it unsafe for you to live alone." "That's not what I asked. Do you believe I'm mentally competent to make my own decisions?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, competence isn't black and white. You can be competent in some areas but need help in others." "I see. And what areas did you determine I needed help with?" "Daily living, financial management, medical decisions." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on months of observation and consultation with Susan." "Did you ever consult with me?" "We tried to, but you were resistant to acknowledging that you needed help." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be thoughtful and fair, and realized he'd become someone who made major decisions about other people's lives without bothering to gather complete information. "Richard, what would you say if I told you that your observations and consultations led you to conclusions that are completely false?" "I'd say that's exactly the kind of thing someone with diminished capacity would believe." And there it was. Richard was so convinced of his diagnosis that any evidence contradicting it was interpreted as proof that he was right. "In that case, son, I think it's time you met with Janet Patterson and learned some things about your father that are going to surprise you." Janet Patterson's office was small and efficient, with motivational posters about aging gracefully and living fully in your golden years. As we sat down, I could see Richard preparing himself for what he assumed would be a discussion about my adjustment issues at Sunset Gardens. "Thank you for meeting with us, Janet," I said. I asked for this meeting because I think there may have been some misunderstandings about my placement here. What kind of misunderstandings, Mr. Morrison? Misunderstandings about my mental capacity, my financial situation, and my actual need for the services provided here. Richard leaned forward. Dad's been saying some concerning things lately about his finances and his reasons for being here. What kind of things? Janet asked. He seems to believe that Susan and I made incorrect assumptions about his capabilities. He's hinting that he has resources or information that we don't know about. Janet looked at me with the same patient expression she probably used with all family conflicts. Mr. Morrison, is that accurate? It's completely accurate. Richard, when you and Susan decided to place me here, what financial information did you review? We looked at your bank statements, your social security information, and what we knew about your pension. You looked at one bank account. Did you look for other accounts? Dad, if you had other accounts, you would have told us, would I? You were constantly suggesting I needed to spend less money and live more cheaply. Why would I tell you about additional resources when you were already concerned about my spending? I turned to Janet. Janet, when families place relatives here, do you verify their financial information independently? We rely on the information provided by the family members who are handling the placement. And do you assess the mental capacity of new residents? We have all residents evaluated by our medical staff within the first week. And what did your medical staff conclude about my mental capacity? Janet consulted her files. Dr. Patterson noted that you scored perfectly on cognitive assessments and showed no signs of dementia or significant cognitive decline. Richard's face went pale. You scored perfectly. I scored perfectly because there's nothing wrong with my mind, Richard. But you seemed confused when we talked to you. You forgot things, you seemed disoriented. I seemed confused because I was confused about why my children were treating me like I was incompetent. I forgot things because I was distracted by the stress of being evaluated and judged constantly. Janet was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match. Mr. Morrison, are you saying you don't feel you need the level of care provided here? I'm saying I don't need any of the care provided here. I'm perfectly capable of living independently, managing my finances, and making my own decisions. Dad, even if that's true, what about safety? What about the risk of falls, medical emergencies, social isolation? Richard, I'm not 108. I've been managing those risks successfully for my entire adult life. I turned back to Janet. Janet, I need to share some information that I believe will change the context of this placement. What kind of information? Information about my actual financial situation. I pulled out a folder that Michael had helped me prepare, containing printouts of bank statements, investment accounts, and patent documentation. Janet, Richard placed me here believing that I was living on Social Security and a small pension. In reality, I receive over $40,000 per month in passive income from patents and investments. I handed her the bank statements. This is just one of several accounts. The total value of my assets is approximately $8 million. Janet's eyes widened as she looked at the documents. Mr. Morrison, these show balances that are ... significant. Significant enough that cost of care is not a factor in my living situation. I can afford any level of assistance I might need in my own home, with my own choice of caregivers. Richard was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Dad, where did this money come from? From 20 years of patent royalties and careful investing, from the inventions I developed in my workshop while you thought I was just tinkering with junk. But you never told us, I never told you because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought there was nothing in it for you. I wanted to see if you'd love me for who I am, or only be attentive when you thought you might inherit something. That's not fair, isn't it? Richard, when was the last time you visited me just because you wanted to spend time with me? He couldn't answer. When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing, not to check on whether I was managing my responsibilities properly? Still, no answer. When was the last time you treated me like your father instead of like a problem you needed to solve? Janet cleared her throat. Mr. Morrison, given this new information, what would you like to discuss regarding your placement here? I'd like to discuss the fact that I was placed here under false pretenses by family members who made no effort to understand my actual situation before making major decisions about my life. Dad, we were trying to help. You were trying to manage what you saw as an inconvenient situation. You decided I was becoming a burden, and you found a way to make me someone else's responsibility. That's not true. Then explain to me why you threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't agree to come here. Winova, you told me you'd consulted with lawyers about guardianship proceedings. Richard was quiet, realizing that his threats were being exposed in front of a witness. Mr. Morrison, Janet said carefully, if you were placed here under duress, based on inaccurate information about your capabilities and financial situation, you have the right to leave at any time. I understand that, Janet, but before I make any decisions about leaving, I want to understand exactly what my son plans to do with this new information. I looked directly at Richard. Son, you've just learned that your assumptions about your father were completely wrong. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The silence in Janet's office stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Richard sat staring at the financial documents spread across the desk, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before: shock, confusion, and something that looked like fear. Dad, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why were you living so modestly? Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to see who my children really were when they thought I had nothing to offer them. But we love you. Money has nothing to do with how we feel about you, doesn't it, Richard? When was the last time you invited me to dinner at your house? We've been busy. When was the last time you asked about my interests, my projects, my thoughts on anything other than whether I was taking my medications or paying my bills on time? Richard couldn't answer, and his silence was more telling than any words could have been. Janet was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in her office. Mr. Morrison, perhaps you and your son would like to continue this conversation privately. Actually, Janet, I think it's important that you hear this. Since your facility was used as part of what amounts to elder abuse. Richard stood up abruptly. Dad, that's not fair. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From living in my own home, from making my own decisions, from having control over my own life, from the risks that come with aging. Richard, I'm 78 years old. I've been successfully managing risks for over 7 decades. What made you think I suddenly became incapable of doing so 5 weeks ago? You seemed confused, forgetful. I seemed confused because you were confusing me with constant questions about my capabilities. I seemed forgetful because I was stressed about being evaluated and judged by my own children. Janet cleared her throat. Mr. Morrison, Richard, perhaps we should focus on what happens next. If you want to leave Sunset Gardens, we can help facilitate that transition. I appreciate that, Janet. But first, I need to understand something from my son. I turned to face Richard directly. Son, You've just learned that every assumption you made about me was wrong. I'm not mentally declining, I'm not financially vulnerable, and I don't need institutional care. So my question is, what are you going to do to make this right? What do you mean, make it right? I mean, how are you going to address the fact that you forced your father into an institution against his will, based on false assumptions, without bothering to gather accurate information about his situation? Dad, if we made mistakes, we can fix them. You can come home. We can help you transition back. Help me transition back to my own life. Richard, do you hear yourself? I shouldn't need help transitioning back to the life you took away from me. But what about safety? What about the concerns we had about you living alone? What concerns? Specific concerns, Richard, not general worries about my age. He was quiet, clearly struggling to articulate concerns that had more to do with his assumptions than with any observed problems. Dad, maybe we were overly cautious, but we love you, and we want what's best for you. What's best for me, or what's most convenient for you? That's not fair. Richard, let me ask you something. In the 5 weeks I've been here, how many times have you visited? This is my first visit. How many times have you called? Once, earlier this week. And how many times have you asked the staff here about my adjustment, my happiness, my quality of life? I assumed they would call if there were problems. You assumed I needed to be here. You assumed I couldn't manage my own life. You assumed you knew what was best for me. And you assumed someone else would monitor whether I was happy or miserable. Janet was taking notes, and I could tell she was recognizing patterns she'd probably seen before with other families. Mr. Morrison, she said gently, we see situations like this more often than we'd like. Adult children make placement decisions based on their own fears and convenience rather than on their parents' actual needs or wishes. And what usually happens in those situations? Sometimes families work together to correct the situation. Sometimes they don't. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be better than this. Richard, I'm going to give you a choice, and your choice will determine the future of our relationship. What kind of choice? You can acknowledge that you made serious errors in judgment, apologize sincerely, and work to rebuild the trust you've broken. Or you can continue to justify your actions and defend decisions that were made without proper information or consideration for my wishes. Dad, of course, I'm sorry if we made mistakes. If you made mistakes. Richard, there's no if here. You forced your competent, financially secure father into an institution against his will, based on assumptions you never bothered to verify. Okay, yes, we made mistakes. But Dad, how do we move forward from here? That depends on whether you're capable of learning from those mistakes. What do you mean? I mean that saying you're sorry isn't enough. I need to see evidence that you understand what you did wrong and that you're committed to treating me with the respect I deserve as your father and as an adult human being. What kind of evidence? I looked at this man who shared my DNA but seemed to have missed some crucial lessons about treating people with dignity and respect. Richard, I'm going to leave Sunset Gardens, and I'm going to return to my home and my independent life. The question is whether you're going to support that decision, or whether you're going to continue trying to manage and control me. I want to support you, Dad. Then prove it. Don't offer to help me transition. Don't suggest modifications to make my life safer. Don't volunteer to check on me more frequently. Just respect my right to live my life according to my own judgment. But what if something happens? What if you need help? Then I'll ask for it. But Richard, I need you to understand something fundamental. My age doesn't make me your responsibility, and your love for me doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without my consent. As we prepared to leave Janet's office. I realized that this conversation was just the beginning. Richard had learned that his assumptions about his father were wrong. But I still didn't know whether he was capable of changing his behavior based on that knowledge. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. When I returned to my independent life, and he had to decide whether to respect my choices or continue trying to manage what he saw as the risks of my aging. That evening, Michael found me in my room, packing the few belongings I'd brought to Sunset Gardens. Word had spread quickly through the facility that Mr. Morrison, in room 237, was not quite who everyone had thought he was. "So, you're really leaving," Michael said, sitting down in the chair that had become our usual spot for conversations. "Tomorrow morning, my lawyer is handling the paperwork to officially discharge me, and I've arranged for a car service to take me home. How do you feel about going back?" "Nervous, honestly. It's been 6 weeks since I've been in my own house. I'm not sure what condition Richard and Susan left it in when they packed up my belongings. What about your relationship with your son? How did he take the revelation about your finances?" I sat down on the bed and considered the question. He was shocked, obviously. But Michael, what concerned me more than his shock was his response afterward. "What do you mean?" Even after learning that all his assumptions about me were wrong, his first instinct was still to manage and control. He wanted to help me transition back to independent living, to make modifications to my house for safety, to check on me more frequently. "He's probably just worried about you. Maybe, or maybe he's incapable of seeing me as a competent adult who can make his own decisions. The money was just one part of what he got wrong, Michael. The bigger issue is whether he can learn to respect my autonomy." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask what you're planning to do about your relationship with your children? I'm going to give them a chance to prove they can change. But I'm also going to protect myself from being put in this situation again." "How? Legal protections?" "I'm having my lawyer draft documents that make it much more difficult for anyone to place me in a facility against my will. I'm also making some changes to my estate planning." "You're changing your will?" "I'm considering it. Michael, over the past 6 weeks, you've shown me more genuine respect and care than my own children have shown me in years. That's forced me to think about what family really means. Mr. Morrison, I hope you'll be careful about making major decisions while you're still processing everything that's happened. I'm not making any irreversible decisions yet, but I am acknowledging that biological relationships don't automatically deserve priority over relationships based on genuine care and respect." Michael leaned forward. "What does that mean for Richard and Susan?" "It means they have an opportunity to earn back their place in my life and my estate. But they're going to have to prove they deserve it through their actions, not their blood relationship. And if they can't prove it, then I'll know that I raised 2 children who see their father as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved." That evening, I called Richard to inform him of my discharge plans. "Dad, that's great news. Susan and I have been talking, and we want to help make your transition back home as smooth as possible." There it was again, the assumption that I needed their help transitioning back to my own life. "Richard, I appreciate the thought, but I don't need help transitioning. I need you to respect my independence, of course, but we could at least come over and help you unpack. Maybe look at some safety modifications for the house. ... No, Richard, I'm going home tomorrow, and I'm going to resume my independent life exactly as it was before you interrupted it. But Dad, what if you need something? What if there's an emergency? Then I'll handle it the same way I've been handling emergencies for 78 years. Dad, please don't shut us out. We love you, and we want to be part of your life." then be part of my life without trying to manage it. Call me because you want to talk to me, not because you want to check on me. Visit me because you enjoy my company, not because you're worried about my safety. How do we know the difference? The question caught me off guard because it suggested that Richard genuinely didn't understand the distinction. Richard, when you call someone because you love them, you ask about their interests, their projects, their thoughts and opinions. When you call someone because you're managing them, you ask about their medications, their appointments, and whether they're handling their responsibilities properly. But we do care about your interests. When was the last time you asked me about my inventions? About what I'm working on in my workshop? About my opinions on anything other than my health and safety? Richard was quiet. When was the last time you shared something about your own life, your work challenges, your family decisions, your hopes and concerns, because you valued my perspective? Still quiet, Richard. You and Susan turned me into a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be loved. Until you can see the difference, we're not going to have the relationship either of us wants. Dad, how do we fix this? You fix it by treating me like the competent, intelligent adult I've always been. You fix it by respecting my judgment instead of questioning it. You fix it by being my son instead of my case manager. And if we do that, will you forgive us for what happened? I looked around my small room at Sunset Gardens, thinking about the 6 weeks of freedom and dignity I'd lost because my children couldn't see past their own fears and assumptions. Richard, forgiveness isn't something you earn by changing your behavior going forward. Forgiveness is something I give because I love you despite the harm you've caused. But trust that has to be earned back through consistent, respectful treatment over time. How long will that take? I don't know, son. How long does it take to prove that you see your father as a person worthy of respect, rather than a problem that needs to be managed? After I hung up, I realized that the conversation with Richard had clarified something important for me. This wasn't just about my children learning that their assumptions about my finances were wrong. This was about whether they could learn to relate to me as an equal adult rather than as a dependent who needed their oversight. Tomorrow, I would find out whether going home meant returning to my independent life or walking into a new kind of surveillance and management by children who thought love meant control. The car service arrived at Sunset Gardens at 10 a.m. sharp. As I carried my single suitcase through the lobby, I noticed several staff members and residents watching with expressions of curiosity and surprise. Word had spread quickly through the facility that the quiet old man in room 237 was actually a wealthy inventor who'd been placed there under completely false pretenses. Michael was waiting by the front desk to see me off, along with Mrs. Chen and Mr. Williams, two residents I'd grown close to during my stay. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Chen said, taking my hand. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept being treated like children just because we're elderly. You showed us that we still have power, even in a place like this, Mr. Williams added. Michael stepped forward with a small envelope. Mr. Morrison, this is from all the evening shift staff. We wanted you to know how much we respected the way you handled your situation. I was touched by their gesture, but I had something more important to give Michael. Michael, this is for you, I said, handing him a sealed envelope. Don't open it until I'm gone. And remember what I told you about dignity and respect. You have a gift for seeing people as they really are. The drive home took 20 minutes through familiar neighborhoods that I hadn't seen in 6 weeks. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was returning from a much longer journey. When the car pulled into my driveway, my heart sank. The house looked abandoned and neglected. The grass was overgrown, newspapers were piled up despite my having called to stop delivery, and several packages sat on the front porch looking like they'd been there for weeks. I paid the driver and stood for a moment looking at the house I'd called home for 40 years. This was where Margaret and I had raised our children, where I'd developed the inventions that made me wealthy, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories and meaningful work. Using my key felt strange after 6 weeks of institutional living where doors were never locked and privacy didn't exist. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately, the musty scent of a house that had been closed up and unlived in. The living room broke my heart. Richard and Susan had hired a packing company that had clearly been instructed to work fast, rather than carefully. Furniture was pushed together in the center of the room and covered with sheets. Pictures had been taken down from the walls, leaving behind faded rectangles on the paint where they'd hung for decades. Even my comfortable reading chair, the one where I'd spent countless evenings reading or working on patent applications, was wrapped in plastic, like it was being preserved for storage. I walked through each room, cataloguing the damage. The kitchen had been stripped of everything except basic appliances. My bedroom looked like a hotel room that had been hastily abandoned. But the worst discovery was my workshop in the basement. It was completely empty. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every project I'd been working on, all of it boxed up and hauled away. The workbench, where I'd developed 17 patented innovations, was bare. The filing cabinets, where I'd kept detailed notes on all my inventions, were gone. Even my comfortable workshop chair, where I'd spent thousands of hours thinking and creating, was nowhere to be found. This wasn't packing for temporary storage. This was dismantling a life. I climbed back upstairs and called Richard immediately. "Dad, how's the house? Are you settling in okay?" "Richard, where are my belongings?" "Everything's in storage, Dad. We hired a professional company to pack everything. Safely, everything. My workshop equipment, my files, my furniture. We thought it would be easier to start fresh when we didn't know when you'd be coming back. Richard, you cleared out my entire life and put it in storage without consulting me. Dad, we were trying to protect your belongings. We didn't want anything to get damaged or stolen while the house was empty. The house has a security system and locks. Richard, my belongings were perfectly safe here. But what if there had been a break-in? What if pipes had burst? We were being responsible. I looked around my empty house and realized that my children had done more than force me into an institution. They'd erased my existence from my own home. Richard, I need you to arrange for everything to be delivered back here immediately. Dad, that's going to be complicated. The storage facility is across town, and we'd need to hire movers again. I don't care how complicated it is. This is my house, these are my belongings, and I want them back where they belong. But Dad, maybe this is an opportunity to simplify. You probably don't need all that workshop equipment anymore, and some of the furniture was getting pretty old. Richard, stop. Just stop talking and listen to me. I took a deep breath and tried to control the anger that was building in my chest. My workshop equipment represents 40 years of my professional work. My files contain the documentation for patents that generate hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. My furniture holds 40 years of memories with your mother. None of it is junk, none of it is unnecessary, and none of it is yours to dispose of. Of course, Dad, I didn't mean to suggest ... You didn't suggest, Richard. You acted, you made decisions about my life and my possessions without consulting me, just like you made the decision to place me in Sunset Gardens without consulting me. Dad, we were trying to help. No, you were trying to manage what you saw as a problem. And the problem was me. There was a long silence on the phone. Richard, I want everything delivered back here by the end of the week. Everything. If so much as a screwdriver from my workshop is missing, I'm going to be very unhappy. Of course, Dad, I'll call the storage company tomorrow. You'll call them today? And Richard, yes, from now on, before you make any decisions that affect my life, my property, or my well-being, you're going to ask my permission. Is that clear? Yes, Dad, I understand. After I hung up, I sat in my empty living room and realized that returning home was going to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. Richard and Susan hadn't just forced me into an institution. They'd dismantled my life so thoroughly that it would take weeks or months to restore it. But at least now I knew exactly where I stood with my children. They saw me not as a father to be respected, but as a responsibility to be managed. And until that changed, I was going to have to protect myself from their help. That evening, I called my lawyer to discuss some changes I wanted to make to my legal protections and my estate planning. Because if Richard and Susan thought they could continue making decisions about my life without consequences, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The moving truck arrived 3 days later, and I watched from my front window as 2 men unloaded box after box labeled with my name and Storage Unit 247. Richard had kept his word about returning my belongings, but what I discovered as we unpacked made my blood boil. The packers had treated my life's work like garage sale items. Patent documents were mixed with old utility bills. Precision tools from my workshop were thrown together in boxes with kitchen utensils. My late wife's jewelry was wrapped in newspaper alongside random hardware from my basement. Worst of all, several expensive pieces of equipment from my workshop were missing entirely. I called Richard immediately. "Where's my oscilloscope?" "Your what?" "My Tektronix oscilloscope. It's worth $12,000, and it's not here." "Dad, I don't know what that is. Maybe it got mixed up with other boxes." "Richard, it's a piece of electronic testing equipment the size of a microwave oven. It didn't get mixed up, it's gone. Maybe the storage company can help us track it down. Maybe you should have thought about tracking valuable items before you decided to pack up my entire life without my consent." I spent the rest of the week going through boxes and creating an inventory of missing items. The oscilloscope wasn't the only thing that had disappeared. Several $1,000s worth of precision tools, test equipment, and electronic components were simply gone. But the missing equipment wasn't what bothered me most. It was the complete disregard for the importance and value of my work. Richard and Susan had treated my workshop, the place where I'd developed innovations worth millions of dollars, like it was a cluttered basement that needed to be cleared out. On Friday evening, Michael Rodriguez called. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the information you left at Sunset Gardens." "Of course not, Michael. How are things there? Different since you left?" "Some of the residents have been asking more questions about their rights, their treatment, their options." "You started something here. Good. No one should have to accept being treated like a child just because they're elderly. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for the letter you left me." I'd given Michael a recommendation letter for his nursing career, along with a check for $5,000 as a token of appreciation for the dignity and respect he'd shown me. "You earned it, Michael. You treated me like a human being when my own children couldn't manage that. Actually, that's why I'm calling. The check was incredibly generous, but I can't accept it." "Why not?" "Because I didn't treat you well to get a reward. I treated you well because that's how people should be treated." I smiled for the first time since returning home. "Michael, That's exactly why you deserve the money. But if you won't accept it as a personal gift, would you consider using it for something that benefits elderly people who don't have advocates? What did you have in mind? There's a legal aid organization that provides free advocacy for elderly people facing involuntary commitment or guardianship proceedings. They're always underfunded. That sounds perfect. There's one condition. I want you to volunteer with them. Use your experience in elder care to help identify cases where families are making decisions based on convenience rather than genuine need. Mr. Morrison, I'd be honored to do that. After we hung up, I realized that Michael represented something I'd been looking for since returning home. Evidence that there were people who understood the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. Over the weekend, I had an unexpected visitor. Susan knocked on my door Saturday morning, carrying what looked like a casserole dish and wearing an expression of nervous guilt. "Hi, Dad, I brought you some food. I thought you might not be cooking much while you're getting settled." "That's thoughtful, Susan. Come in." She looked around the living room, which was still partially packed with boxes I was sorting through. "Dad, the house looks ... different. It looks empty because your brother and I decided to pack up my entire life without asking me. We were just trying to protect your things ... Susan, sit down. We need to talk." She perched nervously on the edge of my couch like she was preparing to flee at any moment. "Susan, I want to ask you about something specific. When you went through my files before having them packed, what did you do with the documents you found?" "Sorted everything into categories: bills, medical records, legal papers, miscellaneous." "And what did you consider miscellaneous?" "Just random paperwork that didn't seem important." "Can you give me examples?" "Old letters, warranties for appliances, instruction manuals, technical documents I didn't understand." "Technical documents?" "Yes. There were lots of official-looking papers with diagrams and numbers. I assumed they were manuals for your workshop equipment." I closed my eyes and counted to 10. Susan had dismissed patent documents worth millions of dollars as technical documents she didn't understand. "Susan, those technical documents were patents. Legal documents that generate income and prove my ownership of intellectual property." "Patents, Dad? I had no idea. They just looked like complicted paperwork." "They looked like complicated paperwork because you didn't bother to read them carefully or ask me what they were." "But Dad, you never told us you had patents." "I never told you because you never asked about my work. When did you last show any interest in what I do in my workshop?" Susan was quiet, clearly realizing that she couldn't remember ever asking about my inventions or projects. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know ... Susan, the patents are just part of the problem. The bigger issue is that you and Richard made major decisions about my life based on assumptions you never bothered to verify. We thought we were helping. You thought you were managing a problem. There's a difference. What can we do to fix this?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be thoughtful and considerate, and wondered when she'd become someone who made life-changing decisions for other people without consulting them. "You can start by acknowledging that I'm a competent adult who has the right to make my own decisions, even if you disagree with them." "Of course you're competent, Dad. We never thought you had me placed in an institution against my will." "Susan, if you thought I was competent, why did you override my clearly stated preference to remain in my own home?" She couldn't answer, because we both knew the truth. She and Richard had convinced themselves that their judgment was better than mine, simply because I was their elderly father. "Susan, I love you. But I need you to understand that what you and Richard did to me was wrong. It was wrong legally, morally, and personally. We know that now. Do you, or do you just know that your assumptions about my finances were incorrect, Dad? What do you mean? I mean that if I had been the financially struggling, mentally declining old man you thought I was, would placing me in Sunset Gardens against my will have been acceptable? Susan thought about the question for a long moment. I don't know. Then you don't understand what you did wrong, and you're likely to do it again the next time you decide I need help with something. As Susan prepared to leave, I realized that my children still didn't understand the fundamental issue. They thought the problem was that they'd been wrong about my capabilities. But the real problem was that they'd believed being wrong gave them the right to make decisions about my life without my consent. Until they understood that distinction, I couldn't trust them not to repeat their mistakes. 2 weeks after my belongings were returned, I was finally beginning to feel at home again. My workshop was reorganized, my files were sorted, and most importantly, I was back to my routine of independent living. But the peace didn't last long. On a Tuesday morning, Richard and Susan showed up at my door together, both looking serious and determined in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Dad, we need to talk," Richard said. "Can we come in?" I led them to the living room. Noting that they both sat down without being invited, a small sign that they still felt entitled to make themselves at home in my space. "What's on your minds?" Susan spoke first. "Dad, we've been talking, and we're worried about you living here alone." Here it comes, I thought. Round 2 of trying to manage my life. "What specifically are you worried about?" "Well," Richard said, "you're 78 years old. You've just been through a major disruption to your routine, and winter is coming. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? What if the furnace breaks down? The same things that could happen to anyone at any age." "Richard, I've been managing those risks successfully for my entire adult life." "But Dad," Susan added, "you don't have to manage them alone anymore. We want to help." "What kind of help?" Richard pulled out a folder. "We've researched some options. There are home health aid services that could check on you daily. There are medical alert systems you could wear. There are maintenance services that could handle household repairs. And there are adult children who could respect their father's independence and stop trying to manage his life for him." "Dad, that's not what we're doing, isn't it?" "Susan, 3 weeks ago you had me forcibly placed in an institution. Now you're here with a folder full of services to manage my daily life. How is that different?" "It's different because you'd still be living at home. I'd be living at home under surveillance and management by people you've hired to monitor me." Richard leaned forward. "Dad, we're trying to find a middle ground here. You want independence, we want peace of mind. These services could give us both what we need." "No, Richard, these services would give you what you need, the illusion that you're managing the risks of my aging. They wouldn't give me what I need, which is to be treated like a competent adult." "But what if something happens?" Susan asked. "Then something happens. Susan, I'm 78 years old. Something is going to happen eventually, whether I have daily check-ins or not. But we could prevent some problems, or catch them early, at the cost of my dignity and autonomy." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Margaret and I had planted together 30 years ago. Some of the plants needed attention, but they were still growing, still beautiful, still worth tending. "Let me ask you both something," I said without turning round. "Do you think I'm stupid?" "Of course not, Dad." "Do you think I'm reckless?" "No." "Do you think I'm incapable of assessing my own needs and making rational decisions about my care?" "Well, ... That hesitation tells me everything I need to know." I turned back to face them. "You still don't trust my judgment. You still think that Your assessment of my needs is more accurate than my own assessment. Dad, it's not about trust. It's about love. We love you and we don't want anything bad to happen to you. Richard, love that requires constant monitoring and management isn't love, it's control. That's not fair, isn't it? Let me give you an example. When you love someone, you ask them what they need and then you respect their answer. When you're controlling someone, you decide what they need and then you implement that decision regardless of their preferences. Susan was crying now. Dad, we don't want to control you. We just want you to be safe. And I want to be free. Safe and free aren't mutually exclusive, but you're treating them like they are. I sat back down and looked at my children directly. Here's what I'm willing to offer you. I will agree to have a medical checkup every 6 months and share the results with both of you. I will agree to update my emergency contacts and make sure you know how to reach my doctors. I will agree to let you know if I'm planning any major changes to my living situation. What about daily check-ins? Richard asked. No daily check-ins, but I will promise to call one of you every few days. Not because you're monitoring me, but because I want to stay connected with your lives. What about home maintenance? I'll handle my own home maintenance, just like I have for 40 years. If I need help with something major, I'll ask for it. Dad, what if you don't recognize when you need help? Then I'll face the consequences of that decision, just like every other adult in the world. Susan was shaking her head. Dad, that's not good enough. What if something happens and we could have prevented it? Then you'll know that you respected my right to make my own choices, even when those choices involved risk. Richard stood up. Abruptly, Dad, this is crazy. You're asking us to just ignore the fact that you're aging, that your risk factors are increasing, that you might need help whether you want to admit it or not. No, Richard, I'm asking you to treat me like the adult I've been for 78 years instead of like a child who needs constant supervision. But what if, Richard? Stop asking what if. What if you focused on enjoying whatever time we have left together, instead of trying to control every variable that might affect my safety? Dad, we can't just pretend that age doesn't matter. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. I'm asking you to respect my right to age on my own terms. The room fell silent. Richard and Susan exchanged looks that told me they thought I was being unreasonable and stubborn. Dad, Susan said finally, if we agree to this, if we step back and let you live completely independently, will you promise to call us if you need anything? I'll promise to call you if I want help. But Susan, you need to understand the difference between wanting help and being forced to accept help. What's the difference? When someone wants help, they maintain control over what kind of help they receive and when they receive it. When someone is forced to accept help, they lose control over their own life. As my children prepared to leave, I could see that they still didn't understand. They thought this was about my being stubborn and prideful. They couldn't see that this was about my right to live as a free adult rather than as a managed dependent, but at least now I'd made my position clear. The question was whether they would respect it, or whether this was just the beginning of a longer struggle over who got to make decisions about my life. For the next month, Richard and Susan kept their word. No surprise visits, no calls asking about my medications or whether I'd eaten properly. No suggestions about services I should consider. It was the most peaceful month I'd had in over a year, but I knew it wouldn't last. The test came on a snowy Thursday in December. I'd been outside clearing my driveway with the snowblower when I slipped on a patch of ice and fell hard on my left shoulder. Nothing was broken, but I was shaken up, and my shoulder was painful enough that I decided to drive myself to the emergency room to get checked out. 3 hours later, I was back home with a diagnosis of a minor shoulder strain and instructions to rest it for a few days. The injury was annoying but not serious, and I was managing the pain fine with over-the-counter medication. I should have known that news of my visit would somehow reach my children. Susan called the next morning. "Dad, the hospital called us. They said you were in the emergency room yesterday." Of course they had. Despite my specific instructions about privacy, someone at the hospital had apparently decided that my adult children needed to be notified. Yes, I had a small fall and wanted to make sure nothing was seriously injured. "Dad, why didn't you call us?" "Because it wasn't serious, and I handled it myself." "But you could have been hurt badly. You could have been lying in the driveway for hours before anyone found you." "But I wasn't hurt badly, and I didn't lie in the driveway for hours. I got up, assessed the situation, and took appropriate action." "Dad, this is exactly what we were worried about." "Susan, what exactly are you worried about?" "That I might fall down. That's a risk every human being faces every day. We're worried that you're taking unnecessary risks by doing things like snow removal at your age. I'm worried that you're using one minor incident to justify renewed efforts to manage my life." "Dad, we're not trying to manage your life. But this proves that you need some kind of support system." "No, Susan. This proves that I'm capable of handling minor emergencies appropriately." "But what if it hadn't been minor?" "Then I would have called an ambulance, just like I would have done when I was 50 or 60. Dad, please, can't we at least arrange for someone to help with snow removal?" I could hear the fear in her voice, and I understood it. But I also knew that giving in to that fear would be the beginning of the end of my independence. "Susan, I've been removing snow from this driveway for 40 years. I have a good snowblower, I'm careful about ice, and I know my own limitations. But yesterday proved that being careful isn't always enough. Yesterday proved that accidents happen. That's not going to change whether I'm 78 or 38. Dad, why are you being so stubborn about this?" "I'm not being stubborn, Susan, I'm being consistent. I told you that I want to live independently and manage my own risks. That includes the risk of slipping on ice occasionally. But we love you. We don't want to see you get hurt. And I love you too. But your love doesn't give you the right to make decisions about how I should live my life." That afternoon, Richard showed up at my door unannounced. "Dad, we need to talk about yesterday. We need to talk about your showing up here without calling first." "Dad, Susan told me about your conversation this morning. You're not being reasonable about this." "I'm being perfectly reasonable. You're the one who thinks a minor fall justifies major changes to my lifestyle. It's not just the fall, Dad. It's the pattern. Living alone, refusing help, taking unnecessary risks." "Richard, what pattern?" "I've had exactly one minor accident in the 14 months since you started monitoring my every move, that we know of. Are you suggesting I'm hiding injuries from you?" "I'm suggesting that you might not tell us about problems because you're afraid we'll overreact." "Richard, do you hear yourself? You're saying that because you might overreact to problems, I'm obligated to report every minor incident to you. I'm saying that if something serious happens, we need to know about it." "Define serious." "Injuries that require medical attention." "I got medical attention yesterday. I drove myself to the hospital, got examined, and came home with instructions that I'm following. But you didn't call us, because I didn't need you." Richard sat down heavily in my living room chair. "Dad, when did you become so isolated? When did you stop wanting your family involved in your life?" The question caught me off guard because it revealed how differently we saw the situation. "Richard, I'm not isolated. I'm independent. And I do want my family involved in my life. I want you involved as my son, not as my case manager. What's the difference? The difference is that when you're my son, you call because you want to talk to me. When you're my case manager, you call because you want to monitor me. But part of being your son is caring about your safety and well-being. Caring about my safety and well-being is different from trying to control my safety and well-being. Dad, I don't understand the distinction you're making. I looked at my son and realized that this conversation was about more than snow removal or emergency room visits. This was about whether he could learn to love me without trying to manage me. Richard, let me ask you something. Do you trust me? Of course I trust you. Do you trust my judgment about my own capabilities and limitations? I trust your judgment about most things, but not necessarily about recognizing when you need help. Why not? Because people who are aging often have blind spots about their own vulnerabilities. And people who are afraid of aging often have blind spots about their parents' actual capabilities. Richard was quiet for a moment, considering this. Dad, what if we're both right? What if you have some blind spots and we have some blind spots? Then we need to talk to each other with respect and honesty instead of trying to manage each other. How do we do that? You start by asking me what I need instead of telling me what you think I need. And what do you need, Dad? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be thoughtful and caring, and I saw someone who was genuinely trying to understand. I need to know that you love me for who I am, not for who you think I should be for my own safety. I need to know that you respect my right to make my own decisions, even when those decisions involve risk. And I need to know that you see me as your father, not as your responsibility. Dad, you'll always be my responsibility. That's what family means. No, Richard, family means that we care for each other by choice, not by obligation. Family means that we support each other's autonomy, not that we manage each other's risks. As Richard prepared to leave, I could see that he was struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd believed about caring for aging parents. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I had hope that my son might be capable of learning the difference between love and control. 6 months later, I was in my workshop, fine-tuning the mechanism for what would become my 18th patent when I heard familiar voices outside. Through the window, I saw Richard and Susan walking up my driveway together, but something was different about their demeanor. They weren't walking with the determined stride of people coming to manage a problem. They looked relaxed. When I opened the door, Susan was holding a cake box and Richard had a bottle of champagne. "What's the occasion?" I asked, genuinely curious. "It's been exactly 1 year since we brought you to Sunset Gardens," Richard said. "We wanted to commemorate the anniversary." "Commemorate it how?" Susan stepped forward, "By apologizing properly, and by showing you what we've learned." I invited them in, noting that they waited to be asked to sit down rather than just making themselves at home like they used to. "Dad," Richard began, "a year ago, we made the worst mistake of our lives. We treated you like a problem instead of like our father. We made decisions about your life based on our fears instead of your actual needs. And we almost lost you because of it," Susan added, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't lose me," I said gently, "but you did lose my trust for a while. We want to tell you what we've been doing to earn that trust back," Richard said. Susan opened a folder she'd brought with her. "Dad, remember Michael Rodriguez, the nurse from Sunset Gardens, of course. He's working in elder advocacy now. We know, we've been funding his work." This caught me completely off guard. "You've been what?" Richard leaned forward. "Dad, we realized that what happened to you happened to thousands of elderly people every year. Families make decisions out of fear, convenience, or financial interest. And elderly people lose their independence without proper representation. So we started the Morrison Foundation for Elder Rights, Susan continued. We've provided funding for legal advocates, educational programs for families, and support services that respect elderly people's autonomy. I stared at my children, hardly believing what I was hearing. In the past 6 months, Richard said, our foundation has helped prevent 43 involuntary commitments and assisted in 17 cases where elderly people were returned to independent living after being inappropriately institutionalized. Rodriguez is our lead advocate, Susan added. He's incredible at helping families understand the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. I felt tears forming in my eyes. You've turned your mistake into a mission to help other people. We've turned our education into action, Richard corrected. Dad, you taught us that age doesn't diminish human dignity, and that love without respect is just another form of control. Susan reached into her purse and pulled out a newspaper clipping. This is from last week's paper. Michael was quoted in an article about elder rights. I read the quote aloud. Every elderly person deserves to age with dignity and autonomy. Families who truly love their elderly relatives will support their independence rather than trying to manage their risks. That's what you taught us, Dad, Richard said. And we're making sure other families learn it too, before they make the mistakes we made. There's something else, Susan said. We've been meeting with the administration at Sunset Gardens, working with them to implement new policies that better protect residents' rights and dignity. What kind of policies? Mandatory advocacy services for all residents, Richard explained. Independent review of all placements to ensure they're truly necessary. Family education programs about respecting elderly autonomy. And most importantly, a patient bill of rights that makes it clear that age doesn't equal incompetence. I looked at my children, these people who had once seen me as a burden to be managed, and realized they had become advocates for the very principles they'd violated in my case. Why? I asked, what made you decide to do all this? Susan's voice was soft but clear. Because we realized that if we could treat our own father so poorly based on false assumptions, then thousands of other families were probably making the same mistakes with people they loved. And because we learned that the best way to honor someone you've wronged is to make sure that wrong doesn't happen to other people, Richard added. Dad, Susan said, we can never undo what we did to you. We can never give you back those 6 weeks of freedom we took away. But we can make sure that our mistake becomes a lesson that helps other families avoid the same tragedy. I stood up and walked to my workshop door, looking at the space where I'd developed innovations that had made me wealthy, where I'd found purpose and meaning, even in my later years. You know what the most valuable thing you've learned is, I said, turning back to them. What? Richard asked. That elderly people aren't problems waiting to happen. We're people with ongoing contributions to make, ongoing relationships to nurture, ongoing lives to live. Dad, Susan said, we've learned something else too. What's that? We've learned that you don't just stop being who you are when you turn 7. You're still the innovative, independent, brilliant man who raised us. Age added wisdom to those qualities, it didn't take them away. Richard stood up and walked over to me. Dad, I need to ask you something. What will you consider being the honorary chairman of the Morrison Foundation? We need someone who understands what it feels like to have your autonomy threatened, and who can speak to other elderly people about their rights. I looked at my son, seeing not the man who had threatened to have me declared incompetent, but someone who had learned from his mistakes and was working to prevent other families from repeating them. I'd be honored, Richard. Susan joined us, and for the first time in over a year, we had a family hug that felt genuine and warm, rather than dutiful or guilty. "Dad," Susan said, "there's one more thing we want to tell you." "What's that?" "We're proud of you. Not just proud to be your children, but proud of how you handled our betrayal. You could have used your wealth to punish us, or your influence to embarrass us. Instead, you used the experience to teach us and to help other people. And we're grateful," Richard added. "Grateful that you gave us the chance to learn and grow instead of just writing us off as hopeless." That evening, after Richard and Susan had left, I called Michael Rodriguez to congratulate him on the Foundation's work. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you know that everything we're accomplishing is built on the Foundation you laid when you refused to accept being treated as less than a full person. Michael, what we're accomplishing is proof that people can learn from their mistakes and use that learning to make the world better. Have you forgiven Richard and Susan?" I thought about the question carefully. I forgave them months ago, Michael, but more importantly, they've forgiven themselves by proving that they could grow from the experience. "And how do you feel about the Foundation using your family name?" "I feel like my name is finally attached to something that reflects my values: dignity, respect, and the belief that every person deserves to control their own life, regardless of their age." As I prepared for bed that night in my own home, surrounded by my own belongings, free to make my own choices about how to spend my time and energy, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this point. A year ago, my children had seen me as a problem to be solved. Today, they were using their resources and energy to solve the real problem: a society that devalues elderly people and families that confuse love with control. The Morrison Foundation would help hundreds of elderly people maintain their independence and dignity. Michael Rodriguez would advocate for people who had no one else to speak for them. And Richard and Susan had learned that the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the freedom to be themselves, even when that freedom involves risks you wish they wouldn't take. But, perhaps most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the most painful experiences can become the foundation for the most meaningful work. My 6 weeks at Sunset Gardens had been humiliating and heartbreaking. But they had also taught my children lessons that would benefit elderly people for generations to come. That night, I updated my will one final time. The Morrison Foundation would receive a substantial endowment to continue its work long after I was gone. Michael Rodriguez would receive funding for his advocacy work, and Richard and Susan would inherit not just my money, but my pride in who they had become. Because, in the end, that's what real success looks like: not the wealth you accumulate or the patents you file, but the positive change you create in the world and the growth you inspire in the people you love. My children had learned to see elderly people as individuals, deserving of respect, rather than problems requiring management. And that lesson would echo through every life they touched for the rest of their days.